Johnny Carson and Bob Hope, two kings of late-night television, locked in a rivalry that never played out in public, but boiled beneath the studio lights. Their feud wasn't about ratings. It wasn't even about fame. It was about respect, or rather, the lack of it. Why would the most trusted man in late-night television loathe America's most beloved comic ambassador? Why would two men who symbolized NBC's golden age of entertainment barely tolerate each other off camera? And how did this animosity remain hidden from millions of loyal viewers? Tonight, we peel back the curtain on what really happened and why the truth stayed buried for so long. To understand the depth of this fracture, you have to step back and see the world both men built. Johnny Carson, born in Corning, Iowa in 1925, was the boy who loved magic tricks and radio microphones more than farm chores. After Navy service during World War II, he studied broadcasting at the University of Nebraska and quickly carved a niche in local radio and television. By the mid-1950 seconds, Carson was writing jokes for Red Skelton and hosting Who Do You Trust?, a daytime quiz show where his wry wit and understated timing caught NBC's attention. Then came 1962. Carson was tapped to replace Jack Paar as host of The Tonight Show. It was a daunting challenge. Steve Allen had established the franchise, Paar had made it unpredictable, but Carson gave it a new soul. His monologues, sharp but never cruel, his banter with guests, and his playful sparring with sidekick Ed McMahon redefined late night. Over the next 30 years, Carson would host more than 4,500 episodes, win 6 Emmy Awards, and become, in the words of historian Robert Metz, the most significant figure in television's second half-century. Bob Hope, by contrast, belonged to an earlier era of entertainment, and he had worn the crown longer. Born in London in 1903, raised in Cleveland, he trained as a vaudevillian before breaking out on Broadway in the 1930 seconds. His comic rhythm, built around rapid-fire punchlines and a cocky persona, transitioned seamlessly to radio. By the 1940 seconds and 1950 seconds, Hope was not just a household name, but a national institution. His work entertaining American troops with the USO cemented him as a patriotic figure, while his decades of NBC Christmas specials made him the network's undisputed golden boy. Hope collected awards like trophies, 5 honorary Oscars, 2 Emmy Awards, even a Congressional Gold Medal. But more than honors, he wielded clout. NBC treated him not as an employee but as an empire. His specials could preempt regular programming. His sponsors bent contracts to keep him smiling. By the time Carson was climbing to fame, Bob Hope had already been untouchable for nearly 3 decades. Yet that's exactly where the first cracks began to show. NBC's stable of stars was small, and while Hope represented the past, Carson embodied the future. Hope's comedy style was tightly scripted, jokes written by teams of gagmen, cue cards held just off camera. Carson's magic was improvisation. The pause, the look, the sly grin after a joke bombed. To audiences, both approaches worked. But to Carson, who valued spontaneity, Hope's reliance on prepackaged laughs felt like a relic. Their careers intersected constantly. Hope would appear on The Tonight Show as a guest, plugging his latest NBC special or film cameo. Carson, dutiful host, would smile and volley the prepared questions. But behind the curtain, colleagues noticed Johnny stiffen whenever Hope's entourage marched in with stacks of scripted jokes. This was the first wobble. 2 entertainers at NBC, one clinging to the old order, the other redefining the new. They could share the same stage, but they could not share the same respect. And soon, a single moment of disrespect would turn irritation into outright disdain. It happened, as so many Carson resentments did, not under the hot stage lights, but in the quieter, less glamorous moments of television production. The year was the late 1960 seconds, when The Tonight Show, starring Johnny Carson, had firmly cemented its dominance in late-night television. Carson was at the top of his game. Ratings secure, monologues sharp, and the NBC brass finally trusting him enough to shape the program his way. Then Bob Hope walked in. Hope was by then a walking institution. He didn't just drop by The Tonight Show, he commandeered it. Whenever he had a Christmas special, a USO tour, or a book to promote, Hope and his team would send word to NBC. The expectation wasn't a request. It was an assumption. Carson, no matter what he had planned for the evening, would clear the decks. The producers would rewrite the rundown. And Carson himself was expected to sit politely, while Hope read his scripted one-liners straight from the cue cards. It was during one of these appearances that the moment came. Hope entered with his entourage, cue cards fanned like playing cards in an assistant's hands. He leaned on them heavily, delivering every line as if reading the evening news. The audience laughed, of course. They were primed to laugh at Bob Hope. But Carson, watching from behind his desk, stiffened. Carson prided himself on the rhythm of the show. He believed in organic flow, in conversation that could veer left or right depending on how a guest played off his energy. With Hope, there was no room for that. Every joke had to be set up, every laugh pre-engineered. Carson had been told by NBC brass to just go along with it. And so he did, smiling thinly, cueing the laughs. But the real insult came afterward. Backstage, as Carson attempted a word of small talk, Hope brushed past him, uninterested in conversation. His team of gag writers swarmed him, already preparing jokes for his next special. To them, Carson wasn't the king of late night. He was just another stage to conquer, another host to keep in line. That stung. Carson, who had spent years honing his craft, who built his reputation on wit and timing, was being reduced to a prop in Bob Hope's endless promotional circuit. For Carson, the message was clear. Hope didn't see him as an equal. He didn't even see him as a peer. He saw him as a convenient platform. It wasn't an explosion, no shouting match, no slam doors, just a moment of cold realization. Carson nodded politely, retreated to his office, and stewed. Inside, though, something had changed. The irritation had crossed a line. And once that line was crossed, there was no going back. The fuse had been lit. From the late 1,960 seconds into the 1,970 seconds, what began as Johnny Carson's quiet irritation toward Bob Hope metastasized into something darker. It wasn't one single outburst. It was a steady drip of encounters, each leaving Carson feeling more trapped, more dismissed, more unwilling to play the dutiful NBC soldier. By the early 1,970 seconds, Hope's grip on NBC was legendary. He had clauses in his contracts that effectively guaranteed him airtime whenever he wanted it. If Bob Hope had a special coming up, The Tonight Show became part of the publicity machine, whether Carson liked it or not. Imagine the scene. Carson's producers carefully laying out the week's guest list, an up-and-coming singer here, a celebrated author there, only to get a call from the network brass. Hope's got a special. Clear Wednesday. Just like that, Carson's carefully balanced lineup was scrapped. Carson loathed it. To him, The Tonight Show was an ecosystem, a place where conversation mattered as much as punchlines. But when Hope came, the show wasn't about chemistry. It was about monologues within monologues. The rhythm flattened into scripted banter. And Carson, who could riff with anyone from Dean Martin to Carl Sagan, was forced to sit through prefab jokes written by teams of gagmen. But here's where it gets complicated. NBC wasn't just protecting Hope. They were underlining for Carson that he was not bigger than the network. He might be the king of late night, but Hope was the eternal patriarch of NBC, and Carson, sharp as ever, noticed. Colleagues recall one night in the mid-1,970 seconds when Carson's patience nearly snapped. Hope arrived with his usual entourage and demanded cue cards be stationed not just off-camera, but positioned in Carson's sightline as well, so Hope could play to Johnny while reading every line. Carson sat stiff, watching this vaudeville relic shuffle through rehearsed gags, barely acknowledging Carson's interjections. Carson tried to improvise once, tossing a sly follow-up question. Hope ignored it, plowing ahead to the next card. After the taping, Carson muttered to Ed McMahon in his dressing room, "He doesn't even hear you. He just hears the writers." It was as close to open contempt as Carson ever let slip in mixed company. Now, if you're wondering why Carson didn't just refuse, the answer was leverage. Hope's specials pulled massive ratings. His legacy as the entertainer of the troops made him untouchable. Carson knew that if he pushed too hard, NBC would side with Hope every time. The worst slight, though, wasn't on camera, it was off stage. One evening in the late 1970 seconds, Hope was booked to follow a serious guest, a statesman promoting a new memoir. Carson, eager to keep the show's flow intact, suggested Hope keep his entrance casual, less bombastic. Hope ignored him. He strode into the green room with his entourage, brushed off Carson's notes, and launched into a monologue the moment he sat down at the desk. To the audience, it was business as usual. Hope telling jokes, Carson smiling thinly. But backstage, Carson's producers saw the fury in Johnny's eyes. The disrespect wasn't just professional, it was personal. Hope hadn't bothered to acknowledge Carson's role as host. He treated the desk, the studio, even the audience as his own property. For Carson, it was the final insult, the sense that he wasn't hosting his own show when Bob Hope was in the building. And then came the awards circuit. By the 1980 seconds, Carson was a perennial Emmy winner, while Hope was receiving more Lifetime Achievement-style honors. At one industry gala, cameras caught the two men greeting each other. Hope extended his hand, beaming. Carson took it, briefly, coldly, and turned away almost instantly. For insiders, it was confirmation of the simmering frost that had become an open secret. And that's when everything changed. From that moment, Carson stopped pretending, even backstage, that he had affection for Hope. The charm he could summon for any guest, the warmth he could show to strangers, vanished the instant. Hope walked into a room. By the mid-1980 seconds, Carson's contempt was no longer just a private feeling. He began dropping subtle barbs in interviews, hinting that Hope's style was outdated, his appearances forced. Industry insiders whispered about the chill between NBC's two biggest icons. It was no longer irritation. It was war by silence, and all of it was building toward one unforgettable breaking point. When Carson finally let his disdain show in a way that even NBC couldn't hide. By the mid-1980 seconds, the polite facade was crumbling. Carson had endured 2 decades of being steamrolled by Bob Hope's entourage, of watching his show bent out of shape whenever the elder comic came calling. But there was one night, one moment, when the tension burst into something visible. The year was 1985. Hope had a major NBC anniversary special in the works, and as always, The Tonight Show was drafted into service as his promotional runway. Carson had no choice. NBC brass reminded him of Hope's untouchable status. The staff cleared the schedule, writers prepared the segments, and Hope's gag team flooded the building with stacks of cue cards. The night arrived. Carson walked onto the stage to his usual thunder of applause, but his monologue carried a sharper edge than usual. Observers later swore he slipped in a barbed line about people who never run out of anniversaries to celebrate. The audience laughed, none the wiser. Those in the know caught the sting. Then Hope entered. He sat down, cards at the ready, and launched into his rehearsed banter. For 10 minutes straight, he barely glanced at Carson, rattling off jokes about politics, Hollywood, and sports. Carson tried once, just once, to break in, to spin one of Hope's setups into spontaneous comedy. Hope ignored it, rolling on to the next cue. The camera caught it. Carson's smile freezing, then fading, then returning in the thinnest possible line. He leaned back in his chair, hands clasped, a portrait of resignation and resentment. But here's where it gets complicated. The audience at home didn't see what happened when the show cut to commercial. Hope continued to talk through his upcoming special, surrounded by his entourage. Carson leaned toward his longtime producer, whispering, "Why do we keep doing this?" The words weren't shouted, but the venom was unmistakable. Ed McMahon, sitting just feet away, looked down at his desk. He'd heard that tone before, but never directed so openly at a guest. When the show returned, Carson soldiered through. But in the days that followed, word spread through NBC's hallways. Carson had finally snapped. He didn't explode on stage, but his offhand comments backstage grew sharper. To colleagues, he referred to Hope as a guy reading jokes with his writer's lips moving. It was cutting, and it was deliberate, and then came the real rupture. Later that year, when NBC suggested another Hope appearance, Carson pushed back. For the first time, he told producers outright that he didn't want Hope on the show. It wasn't a request, it was a refusal. NBC was stunned. For years, Carson had played along, swallowing his disdain for the sake of network politics. Now he was drawing a line. The fallout was swift. Hope's camp was offended, NBC executives were alarmed, and the staff of The Tonight Show braced for impact. Carson had gone from grumbling host to open resistor. The king of late night had finally said no to the network's most sacred cow. And that decision would reshape not only Carson and Hope's icy relationship, but the way NBC navigated its fragile balance of power between aging legends and rising stars. When Johnny Carson quietly but firmly drew the line against Bob Hope's recurring appearances, it wasn't just a personal stand. It was a moment that crystallized a generational shift in American television. Two titans who had once seemed to represent a shared NBC family were now symbolic of an old guard colliding with a new reality. In the years after Carson refused Hope's bookings, his clout at NBC grew even stronger. By the late 1980 seconds, Carson had more leverage than any late-night host before or since. His contract negotiations were legendary. NBC executives bent over backwards to keep him happy, offering unprecedented pay increases and production autonomy. Hope, meanwhile, was still considered a national treasure, but the cultural tide was turning. Carson's decision not to play along with Hope's charade sent a message. The Tonight Show would no longer be an automatic promotional stop for legacy acts. Guests had to fit the rhythm of the show, not the other way around. For Carson, it was about protecting his territory. He had spent more than 2 decades perfecting a style built on conversational spontaneity, and he wasn't going to let it be reduced to a sideshow for someone else's pre-packaged jokes. But here's where it gets complicated. Carson never trashed Hope publicly. He didn't launch tirades or make tabloid fodder. Instead, he wielded silence as his weapon. By simply withdrawing warmth, by refusing to indulge Hope's scripted routines, he reshaped how Hope was perceived in the later decades of his career. To insiders, Carson's disdain became part of the lore. To audiences, the chemistry, or lack thereof, spoke volumes. Bob Hope didn't collapse overnight. His NBC specials still aired well into the 1990 seconds, but the sparkle was fading. The cultural humor shifted, and his old-fashioned style of one-liners and cue cards seemed more like nostalgia than fresh comedy. Younger comedians, Richard Pryor, George Carlin, Robin Williams, were reinventing what stand-up could be. Late night itself was evolving, with David Letterman pushing boundaries and eventually Conan O'Brien carrying the torch. Hope's reliance on his gag writers, once seen as a sign of efficiency, became a liability in an era of improvisation and authenticity. And Carson's quiet resistance amplified the perception that Hope was out of step. Carson, still reigning over The Tonight Show, became the arbiter of who belonged in late-night culture. When he withheld approval, it mattered. And his coldness toward Hope signaled to the comedy community that the old patriarch's era was finally waning. The network itself felt the tension. NBC had built decades of loyalty around Hope, but they also knew Carson was their linchpin. By the 1980 seconds, Carson's contract commanded unheard-of sums, reportedly $25 million a year by the early 90 seconds, and his ratings remained unmatched. NBC realized they couldn't force Carson to bend anymore. The balance of power shifted. Hope, once the immovable institution, became the guest who needed accommodation. Carson, once the junior host, was the franchise. It was a reversal so dramatic that NBC insiders joked, Hope used to be the great network. Now, Johnny is the network. Carson never wrote a tell-all autobiography, but Hope's defenders occasionally spoke up. Writers who had crafted Hope's jokes insisted that Johnny misunderstood Bob, that his reliance on cue cards was a style, not laziness. Others claimed Carson's resentment was rooted in jealousy of Hope's broader fame. But Ed McMahon, Carson's sidekick for decades, confirmed in interviews that Johnny had no patience for Hope's act. He described how Carson bristled at being forced into hosting rehearsed monologues instead of genuine conversation. Now, if you're wondering if the feud ever thawed, the answer is complicated. By the 1,990 seconds, both men were facing Twilight. Carson retired from The Tonight Show in 1992, stepping down after 3 decades and leaving behind an unmatched legacy. His farewell episode drew 50 million viewers, the largest audience in late-night history. Hope, by then in his late 80s, appeared frail but continued to make occasional NBC appearances. The two never reconciled in any meaningful way. When Hope turned 90 inches 1,993, tributes poured in. Carson did not participate with warmth. His acknowledgement was cool, almost perfunctory. Insiders noted the absence. Hope passed away in 2003 at the age of 100, having outlived nearly all his contemporaries. Carson followed just 2 years later, in 2005, at age 79. Even in obituaries, the shadow of their feud lingered. Writers noted Carson's icy demeanor toward Hope as one of the few times the famously diplomatic host let personal feelings bleed through his public role. What does this all mean in the broader scope of television history? The Carson-Hope rift wasn't just personal, it was generational. Hope embodied vaudeville, radio, and the scripted tradition of early television. Carson embodied improvisation, conversational humor, and the modern late-night format. Their feud represented the clash between two eras, one ending, one beginning. And that's when everything changed. After Carson, no late-night host was ever again forced to surrender the desk so completely to an older star. Letterman, Leno, Fallon, Kimmel all owed a debt to Carson's stand. He proved that the host wasn't just a moderator. The host was the show. Carson and Hope never fought with fists or headlines. Their war was quieter, more insidious. A battle of style, respect, and control. In the end, Carson's silence outlasted Hope's punchlines. But the story didn't end with their deaths. It lingers as a cautionary tale about how even legends can clash when the spotlight shifts, and how respect, not fame, decides whether two giants can share the same stage.